In the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, far from the American mainland, a small coral atoll sat silent under the December sun. Wake Island, a lonely crescent of sand, rock, and palms, was little more than a dot on the map. But in the tense, final months of 1941, it became a fortress, a symbol, and eventually a tomb. The war clouds had long been gathering across the Pacific. Japan's empire was expanding at a terrifying pace. From Manchuria to China, from Indochina to the edges of the Western Pacific, the United States, though not yet at war, had watched with growing alarm. As diplomats exchanged false smiles in Washington, Wake Island became a forward outpost, a strategic stepping stone between Hawaii and Guam, a link in the fragile chain that guarded America's Pacific lifeline. By late 1941, the U.S. Navy had turned this desolate island into a small military base. Engineers and civilian workers were building airstrips and fortifications, while a garrison of fewer than 500 Marines trained in the heat and isolation. They were far from home, surrounded by ocean, and unaware that history was about to find them. The morning of December 7, 1941, was calm and uneventful on Wake. The men went about their duties, repairing airfields, checking weapons, and listening to the hum of the sea. But halfway across the ocean, the world was already burning. That morning, December 8th, Wake time, the Japanese launched their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The shock was instantaneous. Reports came crackling over the radio. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. For a few moments, disbelief hung in the air. Then came the grim realization. If Japan had struck Hawaii, Wake would be next. Major James Devereaux, commander of the Marine Detachment, immediately ordered the men to battle stations. Anti-aircraft guns were readied. The island's defenses, incomplete and exposed, came alive. At dawn on December 8, 1941, the sky over Wake roared with engines. 34 Japanese bombers from the Marshall Islands appeared over the horizon, their formation glinting like metallic hawks in the sunlight. The Marines had no radar, no early warning, only a brief flash of sunlight on wings before death rained down. The first bomb struck the airfield, obliterating 8 of Wake's 12 Wildcats on the ground. Hangars erupted into fireballs. Pilots scrambled through smoke, men shouted orders, and explosions tore the island apart. In minutes, nearly half the island's aircraft and many of its defenders were gone. Civilian workers, unarmed and terrified, dove for cover among craters and burning debris. The first attack had come and gone in less than 15 minutes, leaving the sand scorched and littered with twisted wreckage. When the smoke cleared, the Marines counted the dead. 23 killed in the first raid, many mechanics and pilots who never made it to their planes. The survivors buried their comrades quickly, marking shallow graves with makeshift crosses. The men knew this was just the beginning. The Japanese would be back. Reinforcements were promised from Pearl Harbor, but the distance was vast, and the Pacific was crawling with enemy ships. On the evening of December 9th, they could see faint lights on the horizon. Enemy reconnaissance planes circling, scouting for targets. The island's radio operators picked up fragments of coded Japanese transmissions. The siege had begun. Major Devereaux and Commander Winfield Cunningham, the island's naval officer, worked tirelessly to prepare the defenses. Guns were repositioned. Sandbags were piled higher. The remaining 4 Wildcat fighters, patched together from wreckage, became the island's only shield in the sky. Each man knew his post. The Marines, the Navy men, and the civilian contractors, all 1,600 souls on Wake, understood that no one was coming to save them quickly. They were alone against an empire. Yet amid the fear, something hardened inside them, a determination, a refusal to yield. Night fell over Wake with an eerie calm. The sea glimmered under moonlight, and in the distance, flares and ship lights hinted at the approaching Japanese fleet. The men tried to rest in sandbag trenches, their rifles beside them. Some wrote letters they would never send. Others cleaned their guns again and again, their hands trembling but resolute. The air smelled of salt and oil. The silence was not peace. It was anticipation, the stillness before a storm. Then came the morning of December 11th. The sea began to boil with movement. Lookout shouted, "Ships! To the northwest!" Through binoculars, dark silhouettes appeared, Japanese destroyers and cruisers closing in, their gun barrels flashing in the early dawn. The invasion had begun. The Marines manned their guns as shells screamed overhead, striking the beaches and shattering coral reefs. Commander Cunningham gave the order, "Hold fire until they're close." The Marines waited, hearts pounding, hands gripping triggers, as the enemy drew nearer. Then, at 4,500 yards, the first coastal gun thundered. The island shook with the recoil. The first shell struck a Japanese destroyer squarely, blowing its bow apart. Cheers erupted among the defenders. Then another hit. The destroyer Hayate exploded in a massive fireball, vanishing beneath the waves. The impossible had happened. The defenders of Wake had just sunk a Japanese warship. Panic rippled through the Japanese fleet. Their formation broke, ships veering to avoid the deadly shore batteries. The Wildcats roared into the sky, strafing decks and forcing retreat. By mid-morning, the invasion force was in full withdrawal. Wake Island, the tiny atoll no one expected to survive the first attack, had repelled the Imperial Navy. For the first time in the Pacific War, American forces had dealt Japan a defeat. The news spread like wildfire through U.S. military channels. "Send more Wildcats to Wake," one admiral ordered. "They've earned them." Across America, headlines soon proclaimed, "Wake Island defies Japan." The defenders became instant heroes. But as the Marines cheered amid the wreckage, Devereux knew the truth. The Japanese would not forget this humiliation. They would return, stronger, relentless, and in far greater numbers. As night fell once more, the men repaired their defenses under the dim light of burning wreckage. In the distance, thunder rolled over the ocean, or perhaps it was the echo of engines. The next storm was already gathering beyond the horizon. The morning after their stunning victory, the men of Wake Island awoke to a cruel paradox. They had achieved what few thought possible, repelling the first Japanese amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Spirits were high, but so was exhaustion. Every man knew that what they had faced on December 11th was merely a taste of the storm to come. Out in the vast Pacific, the Japanese Navy was regrouping, humiliated yet determined to crush this tiny island that had dared to defy them. For the defenders, there would be no rest, only the long wait for the next wave of hell. The surviving Marines worked tirelessly to strengthen their battered fortifications. Gun crews reinforced sandbag walls, repaired communication lines, and cleared debris from the airstrip. The 4 remaining Wildcat fighters, now symbols of defiance, were refueled and rearmed by hand in blistering heat. Mechanics scavenged parts from destroyed aircraft, patching together machines that should have been grounded forever. Civilians, construction workers, radio operators, and engineers joined the fight, hauling ammunition, digging trenches, and standing watch beside armed Marines. Major James Devereux's orders were clear: "We hold, no matter what." The men clung to one hope: reinforcements from Pearl Harbor. Admiral Frank Fletcher's Task Force 14 with the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga had been ordered to bring desperately needed aircraft, ammunition, and supplies to Wake. For a brief moment it seemed salvation was on its way, but the Pacific was a treacherous sea, and Japan's control of the skies made every approach perilous. Unknown to the defenders, the Japanese had already dispatched a massive second invasion force from the Marshall Islands: 2 aircraft carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft. The Empire of Japan intended to erase Wake from the map. December 12th brought no attack, only the eerie calm of an empty horizon. But that silence was broken the following morning when the droning of engines filled the sky. 27 Japanese bombers descended on Wake, followed by fighter escorts. The defenders opened fire, anti-aircraft guns thundering into the blue. Shells burst around the enemy formation, streaks of black smoke marking near misses. One bomber spiraled downward, crashing into the lagoon. The men cheered, but the joy was short-lived. More bombs rained down, striking fuel depots and storage areas. Fires erupted across the island, black smoke choking the air. Civilians were caught in the open. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with the stench of burning oil and flesh. The Marines could only watch as the heart of their island, the airfield, turned to ruin. By December 15th, Wake Island had been bombed daily. Each raid stripped away another piece of its defenses. The Wildcats, battered but defiant, flew sortie after sortie, intercepting Japanese bombers with fearless aggression. Captain Henry Elrod, known to his men as Hammerin' Hank, became the island's legend. On December 12th, he single-handedly attacked a Japanese destroyer, strafing it until it exploded and sank. In another sortie, he downed 2 enemy bombers before his own plane was hit. When his Wildcat crashed near the airfield, Elrod joined the Marines on the ground, grabbing a rifle and continuing the fight as an infantryman. His courage inspired everyone around him. The men of Wake knew they were fighting a hopeless battle, yet heroes were born in the ashes of despair. Each night, as the horizon glowed faintly from distant fires, the defenders scanned the sea for friendly ships. Messages from Pearl Harbor grew increasingly grim. Relief delayed, hold position. Then, silence. The USS Saratoga was recalled for refueling. The convoy turned back. Wake was on its own. The men didn't know it yet, but Washington had effectively abandoned them. They had become expendable in the grand calculus of war. December 19th. The island trembled again under heavy bombardment. The Japanese were softening the defenses for their second assault. Shells pounded the beaches, blasting coral and sand into the air. The Marines' coastal guns returned fire, but ammunition was running low. Each shell fired was a precious commodity. Civilians worked side by side with soldiers, carrying shells, water, and the wounded. The line between soldier and civilian vanished. Everyone was now part of the defense. Then came the night of December 22nd. The Japanese fleet, now led by Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka, assembled for the final strike. 2 aircraft carriers, Hiryu and Soryu, launched waves of bombers that screamed through the dark sky. Explosions tore the island apart. Fuel dumps ignited in spectacular fireballs. Communications were severed. In the command post, Devereaux shouted over the roar of the bombardment, "Stand by for landing forces!" Just before dawn on December 23rd, the final assault began. Japanese landing craft advanced through smoke and churning water, carrying hundreds of Marines from the Special Naval Landing Forces, Japan's elite shock troops. The defenders waited until the boats were close before opening fire. Machine guns tore into the first wave, shredding wooden craft and spilling men into the sea. For a brief moment, it seemed Wake might hold again. The water turned crimson as Japanese soldiers struggled ashore, but sheer numbers overwhelmed the defenders. Soon, hand-to-hand combat erupted across the beach. Captain Elrod, still fighting with a rifle, led a counterattack to repel the landing near the airstrip. He moved between foxholes, throwing grenades and firing until he ran out of ammunition. Witnesses said he was still shouting orders when a burst of enemy fire struck him down. The men buried him later under the shattered palms, a warrior who had given everything. Elsewhere, chaos reigned. The Japanese had landed on the south and north beaches simultaneously, splitting the defenders. Communications between the Marine positions broke down. The Japanese used flamethrowers to clear bunkers, the smell of burning flesh filling the air. Civilians armed with rifles fought alongside the Marines. Refusing to retreat, Commander Cunningham tried to coordinate resistance from the command post, but Japanese soldiers were already infiltrating the interior. The defenders were being encircled. By 7 a.m., the Japanese flag was rising over parts of the island. Devereux's men continued fighting, refusing to surrender. One group of Marines counterattacked with bayonets, pushing the enemy back toward the beach. Another group fought from the ruins of the airfield, turning wrecked wildcats into makeshift barricades, but ammunition was nearly gone. By mid-morning, the defenders had no more artillery shells and were down to a handful of bullets each. The radio crackled with one final message to Pearl Harbor. It was short, defiant, and unforgettable. Enemy on island, situation critical, still holding. The transmission ended. Moments later, the Japanese stormed the command post. Major Devereux, seeing no further means to resist and unwilling to let more men die needlessly, gave the order to cease fire. The battle was over. Wake Island, the tiny outpost that had defied an empire, had finally fallen. The cost was horrific. Over 100 Marines and sailors lay dead. Alongside dozens of civilian workers, the Japanese had lost hundreds of men and 2 destroyers. For 16 days, the defenders of Wake had held out against overwhelming odds, inflicting the first serious naval defeat on Japan in World War II. When news of the island's fall reached the United States, the reaction was mixed: grief, pride, and fury. Newspapers declared, "Wake Island has fallen, but its defenders fought like lions." In Japan, the victory was celebrated as redemption for earlier humiliation. Yet even the Japanese commanders privately admitted admiration for the defenders' courage. Wake Island, though conquered, had become a legend, proof that determination and sacrifice could shake even the mightiest empire. As the smoke cleared and the Pacific winds carried away the last echo of gunfire, the island returned to silence. The coral sands were littered with the remnants of war, twisted metal, burned weapons, and the bodies of the fallen. The men who survived would soon face an ordeal far darker than battle: captivity. For the defenders, the war was not over. It was only beginning. The defenders of Wake Island had fought until their guns were empty, their trenches overrun, and their comrades dead or dying beside them. When the order to cease fire came on December 23, 1941, it was not out of surrender to fear, but from the grim acceptance that nothing more could be done. They had stood against an empire with courage beyond reason. Yet for the survivors, the real nightmare was only beginning. The rising sun that burned across the Pacific now shone over an island soaked in blood, an island that had become both graveyard and prison. As Japanese troops swept through the ruins, they gathered the surviving Marines, sailors, and civilians at gunpoint. Those who resisted were shot on the spot. The defenders were lined up, searched, and stripped of valuables. Their faces were smeared with grime and blood, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Commander Winfield Cunningham and Major Devereux were separated and interrogated. The Japanese sought to humiliate them, forcing them to bow and shouting orders in harsh tones. Around them, smoke still drifted from the blackened palms and wrecked bunkers. Wake Island, once a defiant outpost, was now firmly under the control of the rising sun. The Japanese victory came at a staggering cost. They had lost 2 destroyers, several aircraft, and hundreds of men in the assault. But the symbolic importance of Wake was immense. It was Japan's first major conquest after Pearl Harbor, proof that their empire could sweep across the Pacific with unstoppable force. Yet even as Tokyo celebrated, the battle's psychological shock ran deep. Never before had Japanese commanders encountered such fierce resistance from a garrison so small, so isolated, and so unprepared. The phrase "Remember Wake" would soon echo through the halls of the U.S. Navy as a rallying cry for vengeance. For the prisoners, however, the hope of rescue faded with each passing day. They were confined in makeshift camps, guarded by armed sentries, and subjected to harsh discipline. Food was scarce, often just a handful of rice or watery soup. Many were forced to rebuild the very fortifications they had once defended. Others were ordered to salvage wreckage for Japanese engineers, working under the blazing sun without rest. Anyone who faltered risked being struck with rifle butts or bayonets. The Marines tried to keep morale alive through whispered prayers, dark humor, and quiet defiance. At night, they could hear the sea washing over the coral, as if erasing the traces of their struggle. Among them were the civilian contractors from the Morrison-Knudsen Company, engineers and laborers who had come to build an airfield, not fight a war. Now they were prisoners of one. Despite their civilian status, they endured the same brutality as the soldiers. Yet their resilience matched that of the Marines. They fashioned tools from scraps, shared food, and kept faith that America would return for them. That hope would sustain them through the darkness that followed. In early January 1942, the Japanese began transferring some prisoners to camps in Asia. Major WWII, Commander Cunningham, and a group of officers were sent to Japan aboard transport ships, crammed into filthy holds with barely enough air to breathe. Others were sent to camps in China, but nearly 100 civilians, construction workers left behind on Wake, were forced to remain under Japanese control. Their fate would soon become one of the war's hidden atrocities. For the Japanese garrison, life on Wake was no less harsh. The island offered little shelter, food, or water. Supply ships were slow to arrive, vulnerable to American submarines prowling the Pacific. As 1942 turned into 1943, the tide of war began to shift. The United States struck back at the Battle of Midway, destroying 4 Japanese carriers and turning the momentum of the Pacific War. The same carriers, Hiryu and Soryu, that had helped capture Wake were now resting on the ocean floor. Japan's once invincible navy had begun to bleed. With each passing month, the isolation of Wake deepened. The U.S. Navy began conducting air raids on the island, bombing its garrison from afar. Japanese soldiers dug deeper into bunkers, cut off from reinforcements, fearing every distant drone of engines. For the Americans who had been taken prisoner, word of these battles reached them only in fragments, whispered rumors, coded notes, and the fleeting hope that liberation might be near. But hope turned to horror in October 1943. As U.S. forces advanced across the Pacific and Japanese supply lines crumbled, the situation on Wake grew desperate. Food shortages led to starvation among the garrison. Then, on October 5th, American aircraft launched a devastating air raid on the island. Bombs tore through bunkers and fuel depots, killing hundreds of Japanese troops. In retaliation, and in a final act of cruelty, the Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Shigematsu Sakaibara, gave an unthinkable order. He gathered the 98 remaining American civilians who had been held on the island since the surrender. Bound, blindfolded, and forced to dig their own graves, they were marched to the northern end of the island. There, under the shadow of the setting sun, they were executed by machine gun fire. The last man, reportedly escaping the initial volley, carved a message into a coral rock before being captured and killed. 98 USPW 51043. The letters would later be found by American forces, i.e. a haunting monument to their sacrifice. The massacre of the 98 civilians became one of the most chilling war crimes in the Pacific. It revealed the depths of Japanese desperation and cruelty as their empire began to crumble. When the war finally ended, Admiral Sakaibara would be tried by an American military tribunal. He confessed to ordering the executions and was hanged for his crimes in 1947. But justice could not erase the horror that had scarred Wake's sands. Meanwhile, many of the Marines and sailors captured in 1941 endured years of imprisonment in Japan and China. They suffered beatings, starvation, and disease, yet they never lost the pride of what they had accomplished. Some survived forced labor in coal mines and shipyards, emerging from captivity in 1945 as emaciated shadows of their former selves. When they finally returned home, the world hailed them as heroes, though few could truly understand what they had endured. In America, the story of Wake Island became legend. Newspapers called it the Alamo of the Pacific. Films and newsreels celebrated the courage of its defenders. Children learned about Captain Elrod, who destroyed enemy ships from the sky, and Major Devereux, who stood unbroken against impossible odds. But behind the glory, the survivors carried silent pain. Memories of friends buried in shallow coral graves, of cries drowned out by the surf, of the hopeless nights waiting for rescue that never came. The spirit of Wake Island lived on in the Marines who fought later at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima. They carried with them the lesson that courage was not measured in victories, but in resistance. Wake's defenders had shown that even in defeat, defiance could ignite a nation. Their stand inspired America to fight back, to rebuild, and to eventually turn the tide of war. By 1944, Wake Island had lost its strategic importance. The U.S. Navy bypassed it, leaving the Japanese garrison stranded and starving. Cut off from all communication, they lingered in isolation until the war's end. When American forces finally returned in September 1945, they found the island silent, the remnants of fortifications rusting in the salt air, the graves of Americans and Japanese alike scattered across the coral. The words carved by the last prisoner still remained, etched into the rock by trembling hands. They spoke of pain, courage, and the unbreakable will of men who refused to fade quietly into history. Wake Island had fallen, but its spirit had not. It had become a testament to what ordinary men could endure when faced with the unimaginable. From that tiny outpost in the Pacific came a lesson written in blood and sand, that defiance itself can become victory. When the final echoes of battle faded, Wake Island was silent. The smoke had cleared, the guns had cooled, and the coral sands were littered with fragments of a fight that had defied all odds. The air was heavy with the memory of men who had stood against an empire. Their voices, once shouting through chaos and flame, were now carried only by the Pacific wind. The rising sun had claimed the island, but not its spirit. For the Japanese, Wake was a victory bought with blood. For the Americans, it became a symbol, an ember of hope glowing through the dark days that followed Pearl Harbor. Across the ocean, newspapers printed the story of the defenders who fought to the last round. Politicians spoke of their courage, mothers wept. A nation wounded but unbroken found something to hold on to. Yet for those who survived, the war was far from over. The captured men of Wake, Marines, sailors, and civilian contractors were marched away under the tropical sun, prisoners of an empire that showed no mercy. Many were shipped to prison camps across the Pacific, their fates scattered like debris on the tide. Hunger, disease, and beatings became their new battlefield. Among them was Major James Devereaux, the stoic commander who had held his ground against impossible odds. In captivity, he became the silent anchor for his men, urging them to survive when hope seemed lost. Years later, he would speak of Wake not as a defeat, but as a measure of courage. "We did our duty," he said, "and that was enough." But on the island they left behind, a darker fate awaited those forgotten in the chaos of surrender. 98 American civilians, construction workers from Morrison-Knudsen, remained on Wake after the garrison's capture. They labored under harsh conditions, building fortifications for their captors. In October 1943, after an American air raid killed several Japanese soldiers, Admiral Shigematsu Sakaibara gave a brutal order. The civilians were blindfolded, marched to the northern shore, and forced to dig a long trench in the sand. When the work was done, they were lined up and executed by machine gun fire. As they fell, one man escaped. Before he was caught and killed, he carved a message into the coral with trembling hands. 98 US PW 51043. That simple inscription became one of the most haunting relics of the Pacific War, a cry from men erased by violence but remembered through stone. When American forces finally returned years later, they found those words still there, etched by courage against oblivion. Justice came slowly. After Japan's surrender, Sakaibara was tried by a U.S. military tribunal. He admitted to ordering the massacre, claiming it was done out of fear of another invasion. The court found him guilty. On June 18, 1947, he was hanged. Yet no punishment could ever restore what was lost. The sands of Wake still hold those 98 souls, resting beneath the same coral that once echoed with gunfire. By 1944, Wake Island had lost its strategic importance. The tides of war had shifted. The US Navy bypassed it during its advance through the Pacific, leaving the Japanese garrison isolated and starving. Cut off from supplies, communication, and command, they lingered in silence, trapped on a forgotten battlefield. Hunger gnawed at discipline. Disease claimed more than bullets ever had. Their empire, once vast and unstoppable, no longer reached them. When American forces finally returned in September 1945, they found an island frozen in time. The once formidable fortifications lay in ruins, rusted guns pointed toward empty horizons. Palm trees grew through shattered bunkers. Graves, both American and Japanese, were scattered across the coral, marked only by makeshift crosses and fading names. And there, among the ruins, the inscription remained. 98 US PW5 1043. The letters had weathered the sea and sun, but they still spoke with the strength of the men who carved them. That message, scratched by trembling hands in the last hours of life, became Wake Island's eternal voice. It told the world of pain, courage, and an unbreakable will. In the years after the war, survivors of the battle tried to make sense of what had happened. Some found comfort in the belief that their stand had not been in vain. Others could never escape the memories, nightmares of air raids, of explosions tearing through the coral, of friends screaming through smoke. These haunted them for decades. Wake had tested not just their endurance, but their humanity. When peace finally settled over the Pacific, the island became a monument. In 1955, the United States built a memorial on Wake, a stark stone tribute inscribed with the names of the fallen. Veterans stood before it, old and frail, staring at the place where their youth had burned away. Some wept quietly. Others saluted, whispering the names of lost brothers to the wind. The island had changed, but its story had not. Every breeze that swept across its shores carried whispers of those desperate weeks in 1941. The world had moved on, yet the memory of Wake remained alive, etched in history as a symbol of defiance, sacrifice, and resilience. Today, Wake Island still lies far out in the Pacific, a lonely atoll surrounded by endless ocean. The modern airfield hums with life, but beneath it rests the ghost of another world. Every storm that rolls through uncovers fragments of the past, bullets, helmets, rusted dog tags, each one a reminder that freedom was bought with blood. Visitors who walk its beaches speak of a strange silence. Not peaceful, but heavy, like the island itself remembers. When the sun sets, painting the horizon crimson, the sea turns to glass, and it's said you can almost hear voices carried by the wind. The voices of men who refused to yield. Wake Island may have fallen, but its spirit never did. From that tiny outpost came a lesson written in blood and sand, that defiance itself can become victory. The defenders' courage outlived the empire that sought to destroy them. Their legacy endures in every Marine who stands the line, in every soldier who fights despite the odds. The world may forget the names, but the story remains. A handful of men, surrounded by sea and sky, stood against an empire and changed history. Their strength became a spark that would grow into the fire of Allied resistance across the Pacific. Wake Island became not a defeat, but a promise. That even in the darkest hour, courage can shine brighter than any rising sun. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history video.